I made the decision to attend my husband's funeral. The problem was, my husband wasn't dead, and the woman sobbing over his casket had been married to him for 23 years. I want to pause here. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. If you're watching this, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I need you to tell me in the comments which city you're listening to this story from. I want to know just how far this message has traveled, because what I'm about to share with you needs to be heard. The October wind cut through my black coat as I stood at the edge of Riverside Memorial Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio, watching a funeral procession I wasn't supposed to know about. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was witnessing. There, in front of a mahogany casket, stood a woman in her late 50s, flanked by 2 grown children, a young man and a young woman who looked so much like my husband that my knees nearly buckled. But it was the photograph on the easel that stopped my heart completely. My husband's face smiled back at the mourners. Richard Allen Hayes, beloved husband, devoted father. The dates underneath read 1959 to 2024. He would have been 65 this March. The same age as the man who had kissed me goodbye 3 days ago and told me he was going to a medical conference in Chicago. The same man who was apparently dead and being mourned by a family I never knew existed. I watched the woman, his other wife, press a tissue to her eyes while the young man wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The young woman, probably mid-20s, placed a single white rose on the casket. A pastor spoke words I couldn't hear from my distance, but I could see the grief rippling through the small crowd of mourners. For 38 years, I had been married to Richard Hayes. I had put him through medical school. I had raised our 2 daughters while he built his cardiology practice. I had stood beside him at every hospital gala, every charity event, every milestone that marked our life together. And now I was standing at a cemetery, watching another family bury him while he was very much alive. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my husband. Conference running late. Will call tonight. Love you. I stared at those words while 50 feet away. Strangers wept over his empty grave. But let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what was destroyed in that cemetery. You need to know what 38 years of devotion looks like when it crumbles in a single moment. I met my husband in 1984 when I was 24 years old, working as an accounting clerk at Ohio State University Medical Center. He was a first-year medical student with wire-rimmed glasses and a smile that made me forget how to count. I used to see him in the hospital cafeteria, studying cardiology textbooks while nursing the same cup of coffee for hours. He asked me to dinner 3 times before I said yes. I thought he was too handsome, too ambitious, too everything for a girl from a working-class family in Youngstown. But he was persistent, and eventually, I fell completely in love with his dreams. Medical school is expensive, and Richard's family had nothing to give. So I worked. I took every overtime shift the hospital offered. I learned to live on ramen noodles and hope, while my future husband studied for exams that would determine our entire future. When his student loans weren't enough, I took a second job doing taxes for a local accounting firm during busy season. We got married in 1986, a small ceremony at the courthouse because we couldn't afford anything else. My wedding dress came from a thrift store, and our honeymoon was a weekend at a motel in Sandusky. But I didn't care. I was investing in our future, in the life we would build together once he became a doctor. Those early years were brutal. Residency meant 80-hour weeks, and a husband who came home so exhausted he could barely speak. I learned to be self-sufficient, to handle everything from car repairs to home maintenance to raising our daughters essentially alone. Jennifer was born in 1990, Stephanie in 1993. I went back to work 6 weeks after each delivery because we needed my income, my health insurance, my stability. By the time Richard finished his fellowship and joined a cardiology practice in Columbus, I had spent a decade holding our family together with determination and duct tape. And when his career finally took off, when the money started flowing and we moved into the beautiful Colonial in Upper Arlington, I thought my sacrifices had been worth it. I switched to part-time accounting work so I could be present for our girls. I became the mother who volunteered for every school event, chaperoned every field trip, hosted every birthday party. Richard worked long hours building his practice, and I understood. I had always understood. That was my role in our partnership. The girls grew up and left for college. Jennifer became a pediatric nurse in Cleveland. Stephanie went into corporate law in Chicago. Our house grew quiet, and I expected Richard and me to finally have the time together we'd postponed for 3 decades. Instead, he seemed to work more than ever. Medical conferences every month, hospital emergencies that kept him away for days, consulting work that required travel I never quite understood, but I trusted him. After 38 years, why wouldn't I trust the man who had promised to love me until death? The irony of that phrase wouldn't hit me until much later. The signs were there, of course. They always are. The separate cell phone he claimed was for hospital emergencies. The credit card statements I never saw anymore because he'd switched to paperless billing. The way he'd become vague about his schedule, answering my questions with responses that technically weren't lies, but weren't quite truth either. 3 months ago, I found a receipt in his coat pocket for flowers I never received. 2 dozen red roses, delivered to an address in Delaware, Ohio, a small town about 30 miles north. When I asked him about it, he smiled and said it was for a patient who had a particularly difficult surgery, a gesture of encouragement from her doctor. I wanted to believe him. So I did. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and doubt, once it takes root, grows whether you water it or not. I became observant in ways I hadn't been for years. I noticed when he took phone calls in the garage. I noticed the new cologne, the updated wardrobe, the gym membership he actually used. I noticed he'd started manscaping in ways that suggested he was preparing to be seen by someone who wasn't his 62-year-old wife. I told myself I was being paranoid. Middle-aged insecurity, empty nest anxiety, all the reasonable explanations that keep women from trusting their own instincts. Then came the funeral. 3 weeks ago, I was having lunch with my old colleague Barbara, who had retired from the hospital's finance department the same year I did. We were discussing our book club selection when she mentioned something that made my blood turn to ice. "Did you hear about the cardiologist from Newark who passed away?" she asked casually. "Richard something. Heart attack, which is ironic for a heart doctor. His funeral was yesterday. Such a shame. His family seemed devastated." Newark was a small city, about 40 miles east of Columbus. I knew Richard had some patients out there, but he'd never mentioned a colleague with his same first name. "That's sad," I replied, my voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "Do you remember his last name?" Barbara thought for a moment. "Hayes, I think. Richard Hayes. I read about it in the obituary section. I always check for names I might recognize." The fork slipped from my fingers. There had to be an explanation. A different Richard Hayes. A coincidence. Something other than what my racing mind was already constructing. That afternoon, while my husband was supposedly at the hospital, I did something I'd never done in 38 years of marriage. I searched for answers. The obituary wasn't hard to find. Richard Allen Hayes, M.D., beloved husband of Patricia and devoted father to Michael and Amanda, preceded in death by his parents. A distinguished cardiologist who had served the Newark community for over 2 decades. Memorial service at Riverside Cemetery, October 15th. The photograph accompanying the obituary was unmistakably my husband. I read those words over and over, waiting for them to make sense. Beloved husband of Patricia. He was my beloved husband, devoted father to Michael and Amanda. Our daughters were Jennifer and Stephanie. Served the Newark community for over 2 decades. He had built his practice in Columbus. None of this was possible. But the photograph didn't lie. The birth year didn't lie. The description of his career, his specialization in interventional cardiology, his membership in professional organizations I knew he belonged to, none of that was fabricated. My husband had died. My husband had a widow and 2 children I'd never met. My husband was sitting in our living room right now, watching the evening news as if everything was normal. I needed to see for myself. I needed proof that this nightmare was real before I could figure out how to wake up from it. The next morning, I told Richard I was visiting Jennifer in Cleveland. Instead, I drove to Riverside Cemetery in Newark, arriving just as the funeral began. I parked far enough away to avoid notice but close enough to witness everything. What I saw in that cemetery rewrote the story of my entire life. Patricia Hayes was an attractive woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from decades of marriage. She greeted mourners with grace, accepting condolences for a husband she genuinely believed was dead. Her children, Richard's children, stood beside her, with the shell-shocked expressions of people whose world had just shattered. I watched for 2 hours. I watched the burial of an empty casket. I watched a family grieve for a man who was probably, at that very moment, answering emails in his Columbus office. And I watched the life I thought I knew dissolve into something I couldn't recognize. When I got home that night, Richard was concerned about my long drive. He made me tea, rubbed my shoulders, asked about Jennifer and the grandchildren. He lied with such effortless sincerity that I wondered if I had ever known him at all. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because standing in that cemetery, watching another woman bury my husband, I had realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just an affair. This was a parallel life, carefully maintained for over 2 decades. And the only way he could have faked his own death with that other family was if he was planning something that required Richard Hayes to officially cease to exist. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I made my next move. The following morning, I called my youngest daughter, Stephanie. She was a corporate attorney specializing in forensic accounting, the perfect combination for what I was about to ask. "Sweetheart, I need your help with something," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's about your father, and I need you to promise me you'll listen to everything before you react." The silence on the other end was heavy. Then, quietly, she said, "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years." "What do you mean?" "I found something during the estate planning review Dad asked me to do. Accounts I couldn't trace, property I couldn't explain. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to hurt you. But I've been watching, Mom. Something isn't right." Within 48 hours, my daughter had assembled a dossier that would have impressed the FBI. Stephanie had always been thorough, but what she uncovered went beyond anything either of us expected. Richard Hayes had not one life, but 2. Fully formed, completely separate existences maintained with the precision of a surgeon and the deception of a con artist. In Newark, Ohio, he was Dr. Richard Hayes, married to Patricia Morrison Hayes, since 2001. They lived in a beautiful Victorian home on a tree-lined street. He told Patricia he was a widower whose first wife had died of cancer, leaving him with no children. Their son Michael was 22, recently graduated from Ohio State. Their daughter Amanda was 19, a sophomore at Denison University. The financial trail was staggering. Richard had been siphoning money from our joint retirement accounts for over 20 years, transferring funds to a separate investment portfolio registered in Newark. He'd purchased the Victorian home outright, cash, using money I thought was going toward our own retirement security. He'd paid for both children's private school education, their college tuition, their cars. The total amount diverted from our family to his second family exceeded $1.2 million. But the faked death was the part that made my blood run cold. Through medical board records and death certificate filings, Stephanie discovered that Richard had been slowly laying the groundwork for disappearing from his Newark life. He'd complained to colleagues there about chest pains. He'd discussed his family history of heart disease. He'd even had a cardiologist friend file a death certificate, a colleague who owed him favors and apparently didn't ask too many questions. "He faked his own death to escape Patricia," I said, trying to understand. "But why now? Why after 23 years?" "Because Patricia was starting to ask questions," Stephanie replied. "Look at these." She emailed me a series of documents. Patricia hired a private investigator 2 months ago. She was getting suspicious about his conference schedule, his unexplained absences. She was close to discovering us. So instead of getting caught, he killed himself, figuratively, and collected a $2 million life insurance payout in the process. Patricia is the beneficiary, but guess who controls the investment account where those funds will eventually be deposited? An account Richard could access whenever he wanted. An account his grieving widow would have no reason to monitor closely. An account that would fund his retirement while both families believed he was either dead or faithfully devoted. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. But the part that hurt most wasn't the money or the lies or even the other family. It was realizing that for 23 years, every time he'd said he loved me, every anniversary dinner, every holiday together, every moment I'd believed was genuine, He'd been doing the same thing with another woman who believed the exact same things. I wasn't special. I was just the first draft. I spent 2 weeks preparing. Stephanie and I worked with a family attorney who specialized in complex divorce cases involving fraud. We documented everything: financial transfers, property records, the fraudulent death certificate, the insurance payout. We contacted the state medical board, the insurance company's fraud division, and the prosecutor's office. But before any legal proceedings began, I needed one thing. I needed Patricia Hayes to know the truth. Not through lawyers or investigators, but from me, the woman who had unknowingly shared a husband with her for over 2 decades. I found her at a grief support group for widows, held at a church in Newark every Thursday evening. I watched her go inside, looking fragile but composed, still mourning a man who was very much alive. I waited until the meeting ended, then approached her in the parking lot. "Patricia?" I asked gently. She turned, her eyes red-rimmed but curious. "Yes? Do I know you?" "No. But I know your husband. Or rather, I know the man you buried 3 weeks ago." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about? Richard is dead." I watched them lower his casket into the ground. "Richard Hayes is alive," I said, and handed her a photograph. "This was taken yesterday in Columbus. He's sitting in the living room of the house we've shared for 32 years. We've been married for 38 years, Patricia. I'm his first wife, and I'm so sorry to tell you this way, but you buried an empty coffin." Patricia stared at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph. Her hands began to shake. "That's not possible," the hospital called. "The death certificate. We had a funeral. My children are devastated." "I know. And I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I thought you deserved to know the truth before the insurance company and the medical board started their investigations." The story poured out of her in fragments. How they'd met when she was a hospital administrator in Newark. How he'd told her he was a widower, lonely, looking for a second chance at happiness. How they'd built a life together, raised children together, created a home she thought was entirely theirs. "He told me his first wife died of cancer," she whispered. "He said he'd never gotten over the loss. That's why he was so protective of his privacy, why he didn't talk much about his past. I thought he was still grieving. I thought I was helping him heal." "You were being manipulated," I said. "We both were. He played us against each other for 23 years, and he was planning to disappear completely with insurance money and retirement funds he stole from both our families." Patricia's grief transformed into something harder, colder. "What do we do now?" "Now," I said. "We stop letting him control the narrative." The plan came together over the following week. Patricia and I, 2 women who should have been enemies, became unlikely allies in dismantling the man who had betrayed us both. Richard was planning to leave for another medical conference on Saturday. What he didn't know was that there would be no conference, no hotel room, no escape. Instead, there would be a gathering at our Columbus home, one he couldn't possibly anticipate. I told him I wanted to throw a small dinner party for his colleagues, a celebration of his upcoming retirement. The retirement he'd been planning without telling me, the retirement that would have freed him to disappear entirely. He was suspicious at first, but I played the role of devoted wife so convincingly that he eventually agreed. The guest list was strategic. His partners from the Columbus practice, our daughters Jennifer and Stephanie with their families, his medical school roommate who had remained a close friend, our neighbors of 20 years, people whose opinions mattered to him, whose respect he had cultivated carefully. What he didn't know was that Patricia and her children would also be attending, entering through the back door after all the other guests had arrived. The dinner began normally. I served the roast chicken he loved, poured the wine he preferred, played the gracious hostess while my heart pounded with anticipation. Richard charmed the room as he always did, telling stories about difficult surgeries and grateful patients, painting himself as the dedicated physician who had devoted his life to saving others. After dessert, I stood up and clinked my glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," I announced, "to my husband Richard, who has spent the last 4 decades building a remarkable career." Richard beamed, accepting the praise he believed he deserved. "But before we toast," I continued, "I think some people deserve to be part of this celebration who weren't originally invited." The confusion on his face was the first crack in his composure. The back door opened, and Patricia walked in, followed by Michael and Amanda, 3 people who should have been in Newark mourning a man they believed was dead. 3 people who were now standing in the living room of the house their father had hidden from them for their entire lives. "What?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "What is this?" Patricia stepped forward, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Hello, Richard. Or should I say, hello from the grave." The room erupted. Guests looked from Patricia to me, from Richard to the 2 young adults who were clearly his children, but who none of us had ever seen before. My daughters stared at their half-siblings with expressions of shocked recognition. Richard's medical partners exchanged alarmed glances. I let the chaos unfold for a full minute before continuing. "For 38 years, I said, I believed I was married to an honest man. I believed the sacrifices I made, working 2 jobs so he could finish medical school, raising our daughters essentially alone, supporting his career at every turn. I believed those sacrifices were building something real. But 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband has been living a double life since 2001. I handed out folders Stephanie had prepared, bank statements, property records, the falsified death certificate, photographs of Richard with his other family. He told Patricia he was a widower, I explained. He told her I was dead. He created an entire fictional history so he could marry her without technically committing bigamy. And 3 weeks ago, he faked his own death to escape that marriage before Patricia discovered the truth. She hired a private investigator, Michael said, his voice shaking with rage. Dad knew she was getting close to finding out about his Columbus life. So he pretended to have a heart attack and died. We buried him. We grieved. While he was sitting here, eating dinner with another family, we were planning his memorial service. Richard stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Calculation. Fear. The desperate search for a way out. "This is a misunderstanding," he started. "A misunderstanding?" Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have your death certificate, Richard. I have the insurance payout. I have 23 years of lies." "Dad!" Amanda's voice cracked. "Is any of this true? Did you really fake your death? Did you really have another family this whole time?" Richard looked at his youngest child, the daughter he had raised in Newark, the girl who had wept at his funeral. For a moment, I thought I saw genuine pain in his eyes. Then the mask slipped back into place. "You don't understand the pressures I've been under," he said. "The demands on someone in my position. I made choices I'm not proud of, but I did it for my families, for all of you. You stole $1.2 million from our retirement," I said flatly. "You used money that was supposed to secure our future to buy another woman a house and send your secret children to college. You didn't do anything for us. You did it for yourself." Stephanie stepped forward with a second set of documents. "These have already been filed with the State Medical Board, the Insurance Fraud Division, and the county prosecutor. You're facing charges for insurance fraud, falsifying a death certificate, and financial exploitation. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation." Richard's face went gray. "You can't do this. My career—" "Your career," Patricia interrupted, "was built on lies. Everything was built on lies." The silence that followed was broken by our neighbor, Dan Henderson, who had known Richard for 2 decades. "I played golf with you every Sunday," Dan said quietly. "I trusted you with my own cardiac care. And this whole time, you were living like this?" He shook his head and walked toward the door. "I don't know who you are, Richard. And I don't think you know either." One by one, the guests left. Richard's partners departed, with promises of emergency board meetings. Our daughters stood together with their half-siblings, the 5 children of Richard Hayes, trying to process a shared history none of them had known existed. Richard didn't fight when the police arrived. He had nowhere to run, no narrative left to manipulate. The man who had controlled 2 families for decades was finally, completely exposed. It's been 9 months since that dinner party. The legal proceedings are still ongoing, but Richard has already lost everything that mattered to him. His medical license was permanently revoked. The insurance company is pursuing criminal charges for the fraudulent death claim. Our divorce was finalized last month, and thanks to Stephanie's forensic accounting, I received full restitution of the funds he had diverted, plus a settlement that will keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. Patricia and I have become unlikely friends. We meet for coffee every few weeks. Two women who were played against each other for decades, now supporting each other through the aftermath. Our children have formed their own complicated relationships, half-siblings navigating the bizarre legacy their father left behind. I moved out of the Columbus house last spring. Too many memories, too many lies embedded in the walls. I found a bright apartment downtown, decorated it exactly the way I wanted, and started building a life that belongs entirely to me. Did you like my story? And what city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. Give us a like if you enjoyed this story. Last month, I went back to school. At 63 years old, I'm finally pursuing the master's degree in accounting I put aside when Richard needed me to work instead of study. I sit in classes with students young enough to be my grandchildren, and I've never felt more alive. Because here's what I want to leave you with. If you're watching this and something feels wrong in your relationship, don't ignore that feeling. Don't make excuses for behavior that doesn't match promises made. The signs are always there. We just have to be brave enough to see them. I wasted 38 years on a man who wasn't worth 38 minutes, but I refuse to waste another day. My life is finally my own, and I intend to live every moment of it. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. By the way, don't forget to subscribe. It encourages me to keep bringing more stories like this. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.